Hey there, and welcome to That News You Care About, a weekly video game news show from the folks over at That Nerdy Site. Today is Tuesday, July 20th, 2021, and I'm one of your hosts, Logan Wilkinson. And joining me this week is my Phoenix son, Trevor Starkey.
Speaking of the Phoenix Suns, what a week it has been since you and I recorded with Jono, and we're like Suns were up 2-0.
We're gonna sweep it.
We are with 9 minutes 45 seconds left in the fourth quarter of Game 6. Right now, I'm looking at a score that is 84-82 Bucks to Suns. So like well before this episode is done recording, we will know if the Suns are going to a Game 7 or if they're taking it here if they're losing in
the fourth quarter of an NBA playoff game. So maybe it'll still be going on by 40 minutes from now. Actually, it'll be pretty close.
I mean, yeah. But yeah, it's like I just think of how funny it was, like because we were like, oh yeah, it'll maybe be done, and it really wouldn't have been because the Game 4 was on like Wednesday of last week or whatever. But then just the Bucks have gone on a 3-game streak here, so I've I definitely did not get back into like sports or anything, but I've been like Googling NBA playoffs for the scores for the last couple weeks, really, and so seeing my timeline kind of be like, oh, like I have steeled myself for another Suns disappointing finals, basically when we lost Game 3. I was like, oh, I don't trust us to come back from this now. I've lived in Arizona too long. Anyway,
been racing for 30 years since Charles Barkley. Because your only title is the D-backs.
Yep.
This is not an Arizona sports podcast, unfortunately, but maybe one day. Instead,
nobody wants that. Not even Arizona.
Ryan McCaffrey, right? He's the only listener we'd have. Instead, we're going to be talking about Steam Deck. So very different, actually, from Arizona sports. Actually, maybe not too differently, because maybe they could each end up being a disappointment and a flop. Boom, getting out of the way early. So this all comes from a Verge article that Trevor shared in the Slickety Slack, and that I had kind of Steam Deck obviously been talking to him the past week or so.
It's amazing to think that it got announced in between our last episode and now. It like got announced, and then the next day it was on sale, and like so like they basically shadow dropped a console. Obviously, it's not actually out in people's hands yet but yeah, it was almost the $9.99 Dreamcast all over again or whatever.
God, R.I.P. And so I thought it would be fun because the Verge article kind of has a list of 6 reasons why the Steam Deck won't flop like Valve's Steam machines. That's the name of the article. To kind of run through my reasons why I agree or disagree with each point. I would think ultimately I probably agree with like 50% to varying levels of agreement. And kind of mutually kind of go through, give our thoughts on the Steam Deck in the Verge article kind of thing, and go from there. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to begin with point number 1, Trevor. I don't know if you did handwritten notes like I did. You probably did.
Not handwritten notes, but I have a notepad up on my screen with them.
Yeah. So the first point is Valve is building the hardware itself. And I'll throw it to you first, Trevor. Do you agree or disagree with this being a positive for the console?
I mean, especially compared to the Steam machines, it is absolutely a positive. Like the notes I have on this one are, the problem with the Steam boxes, the Steam machines, was that Valve was going to be hands off. They were like, hey, like we're not going to build this. Like we've got the OS for people and they can use, but we're going to leave this to the people who know hardware to build hardware. And the problem with gaming hardware is that that's not where the gaming money is made. Like from the beginning of gaming time, most of the money gets made on the software side of things. Very few consoles or handheld devices are ever sold at a profit themselves. So it was basically like Valve saying like, we don't want to take any of the risk because we're going to make the money on software anyway. And then all of the PC people were like, well, why would we put money into making this thing that we're going to sell for $600, but it's going to cost us $700 to make? We're not going to get a good hefty cut of the software sales because it's still going to be sold through Steam. So it was largely like, that was a really dumb idea. So the fact that Valve is getting behind this and they're the ones making the hardware, like they're the ones that can afford to make the hardware and to take the loss on the hardware if it is sold at a loss, because they're going to be raking in the money on the Steam sales already as is.
I think so. The note I literally put was, I disagree that this is the reason above all else why the Steam machines failed, as the Verge article kind of talks about. Like, it's the one reason that towers above the rest. I don't agree with that. I think there were bigger reasons than this that the Steam machines didn't take off. I do, however, think it's pretty obvious that this is going to be a plus. This is going to be a benefit that Valve itself is responsible for the hardware itself. I am curious, and this part I'll save it for I'll save that point for later on because it'll be like other topic we're talking about. But like, it's obviously going to be a benefit. It's only going to help the machine, not hurt it. That Valve is obviously helping out on the hardware, not even helping out, doing the hardware side of it itself, and kind of seeing almost like that initial investment they're putting into it, whereas before they didn't even put like that much into it. It felt like we're not gonna like worry about the hardware itself, and here they're at least that interested in it, right? Because like one of the things that I will mention probably a half dozen times, put a counter up, in this episode is the idea that like all of these console makers, whether it's like Amazon or Google or Valve or whoever it might be, they never actually care, right? They're never actually like in it to win it like you have to be, right? Like, you don't become Sony Microsoft by happenstance, right? Like, it takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of investment, and you like have to want it, kind of thing, right? Like, for how huge the video game industry is, it is 3 players that control the console space, and only like 1 or 2 others that really are anything in like the PC side of things. And so it's very closed, and the competition is really intense. And so if you're not willing to give it all, like Google, if you're willing to just cut something off after like 6 months, or Apple, who never, like these companies that just don't even care, I don't think it's going to take off. And I think in 2015, Valve didn't really care. And so the big test for me will be how much they care and how much they're going to like put into it this time around. And if the answer is a lot, they're really supposed to kind of put the whole weight that they have behind it, it can do something. I also think in that vein, it's something that we'll get to later on, of like having reasonable and realistic expectations. But for right now,
well, I would just add on to that before moving on to the next point, that I think Valve, obviously in between the Steam boxes and now, Valve did get behind hardware in the VR space. And while VR space is absolutely still an even more niche than the console space, obviously, like it is pretty much, you know, like the Valve, it is what is it, the Valve Index, there's PSVR, obviously, there's Oculus, and then what, like HTC Vive. So like they're one of the heavy hitters in that space, and I think they at least committed in that space long enough to, and we'll get to another one of the points later on, I'm sure, to kind of see some of the fruits of that labor, and I think like that is another element of like that gives me faith in that, hey, they're getting behind the hardware on this, like they got behind the hardware on in the VR space. They like it's interesting because Valve has very much been like, since they became a storefront, like they're content to do that and make their money off of that. And so like seeing them get excited about hardware in this way is like, I don't know how excited they were about the Steam machines, because I didn't really follow the space that much then. I remember like it coming up and everybody being like, I don't think this is going to work, because you're looking at like, 20 different versions of this thing. How's that going to like play out? And like it was, in the wake of like the Ouya and stuff like that, where we just kind of like everybody wanted to make their own console and they thought it was easy to do or something like that. But it isn't, as difficult. Kind of touched on. Like even like, I mean, when you think of the big 3, Xbox came into the space 20 years ago, and even their first foray into it didn't like didn't do great. Like eventually
Yeah.
they started kind of making some traction, but then like they really took off in the 360 generation. So yeah, like they like even this might not take off right out the gate, but it could also still be like a good first step into
I th-
the hardware space. And I think
yeah.
Valve has the the industry weight that they could. Like I like if it looking around the industry at like who else could jump in and make a console space. Like you kind of touched on like Google and Amazon, they're not interested in making consoles, they're interested in getting into cloud gaming and stuff because that's where so much of their infrastructure is in cloud services already anyway. Valve doesn't have like cloud services behind them, so them jumping into the console space makes sense in a way that like Epic I could see creating a console because they have the cash to do it. I don't know like why they would ever want to with Fortnite with
Yeah.
the Fortnite money they're making, but like Steam or Valve doing it with the Steam money they're making makes about as much sense. So I could see those two players basically being the ones that could jump into the space because you're not going to see like a Ubisoft do it. You're never going to see like those level publishers try and do that. So like Valve is one of the two remaining kind of juggernauts that I think could. Um, and so it'll be interesting to see like how that all plays out, I guess.
I think the final thing for me on that is even among the big three in the video game industry of Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, I think you see it's really hard, right? Like you could argue that Microsoft has had one successful generation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was just a 360, right? And then the first one, like you said, there was a lot of growing pains in that. And then the most recent one, there was obviously a lot of challenges in terms of like it competing against first the Wii U, but mainly the Switch and the PS4. And so I think even there you see a lot of problems. Obviously, Nintendo has had its own host of issues and trying to kind of adapt constantly after kind of falling behind, I think, on the hardware spec side of things, right? Like really only PlayStation has been like pretty consistently successful in terms of like what it's tried to do. And even it stumbled during the PS3 generation, right? Like it's not easy even for people who've been doing it for, like you said, 20 years at a minimum.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in some cases, basically since the dawn of like the modern video game industry with Nintendo. And so,
And they also and the Vita clearly didn't take off in
yeah,
the way
100%.
that they
That's
may have wanted it to.
another great point, right? And so I think there is totally this thing that I always feel that I give a lot of these wannabe console makers a hard time because we've seen it feels like a million of them now, and yeah, I feel like inevitably people get this is gonna be like a groundbreaking moment, right? And then in like a year later we see like they've discontinued all services for the platform. And it's like because they're not willing to put in the work for it, right? And more than that, because the expectations they have for it are so out of whack, right? Like you're not going to come in and sell 100 million units like the PS1 did anymore. Like that's not a reasonable expectation because the market is different than it was in 1995, right? Like then it was basically you had Nintendo, and even then Sega was already kind of dying, right? Microsoft didn't exist. It was basically just Nintendo, and that was it. So if you could do something that wasn't Nintendo, you had a good chance, and they could, right? And Microsoft could do its own thing, but even then, like we mentioned, it struggled, right? It sold 20, 30 million units its first generation. And so I think having an expectation of like, hey, there's only more competition now, to say nothing of like what mobile gaming has done in terms of like diluting these sales numbers. So having reasonable expectation, having that set, like this is what we're expecting. If we get this number, we're happy. If we get over it, we're super happy. We're ecstatic, right? It's great news. But if we can just hit this modest goal, that's great. And we can kind of build from there, right? Build up that community, build up those people. But we'll get more into that on another list down the line. So I'm going to shift it over to the second point, which is Linux is no longer death sentence. And I will hop first onto this one because I find my own line pretty funny if I do say so myself, where I'm just like, I don't know, man. Linux isn't a death sentence, but 6 years created and less than 15% of Steam titles isn't great either. Right? So, like, I think, Linux isn't a death sentence, but it's certainly not ideal anymore either, right? Like, the number is still the case that fewer than 15% of all Steam sales officially support Steam OS, and then it goes into like, but thanks to the, yeah. It's not great. I think it's fair to say that it's not great either, right? And I think this is sort of my general feelings on the Steam machines. Spoiler alert for the episode, is that I generally think it's not great, right? Like I think it's gonna do
Mm-hmm.
fine at the best, and then it'll flop at the worst. That's sort of the range I have for it. And I think this is another instance where like it just depends on how much buy-in they get from all parties, really, whether it's obviously like players and gamers, to like devs and everyone else. And like I just don't know, first off, what that buy-in looks like from all parties, and second off, how quickly they get it, because that is a thing too. Like you need to get it kind of quicker than later on down the line. And so I'm curious to see what that looks like for the Steam Deck, obviously.
So you froze for a good 30 seconds for me there. So I had missed a
Oh,
lot of your argument. So I apologize if
okay.
I end up like retreading anything.
No,
I'll
you're
do what I
good.
can to edit it together in post and stuff. Um, Admittedly, like Linux is one of the things I am like least familiar with. But yeah, based on kind of what is produced here, I think the thing that is the most in the Steam Deck's favor compared to, again, the Steam machines is that the Steam Deck isn't beholden to Linux. While like
Mm-hmm.
Linux is definitely going to be like the optimal system, they're like the fact that you can have Windows installed on there, or and presumably you'll be able to have, like, if you really want to play Stadia or XCloud or something, you can download those apps. Like the fact that they kind of came out right out the gate and were like, it's going to be an open platform, it's not going to be just Steam. I like Paris Lilly over on Kind of Funny, I believe, was talking like, immediately the Xbox team is figuring out how can they get XCloud on this thing, because
Mm.
like the prospect of a handheld PC way is even that much more, or like that much better than trying to play XCloud on your phone, which is currently their big selling point. So like being able to take anything on Xbox and put it in a handheld thing defeats any kind of desire that Xbox would ever need to create something in their own version of the Switch space. So
Mm.
like the fact that they can piggyback on this is only going to potentially help like the movement of this. So I think that's definitely an opportunity that exists out there. Is And who knows, maybe PlayStation will get in on that too, and like create a PlayStation Now app or something
Yeah,
like that, so
PS now.
you can play any of the games in that service on this handheld device, since they don't have their own dedicated handheld anymore. So I think the fact that they're not locking it down to Linux and the Steam OS is like, that is, I mean, like, if I had to kind of rank these, that's probably the thing I would say is like the biggest selling point for them, is that like it's above and beyond like the fact that they're making the hardware. It's they're making hardware that all of the people who bought PSPs to jailbreak them will want to get in on, and kind of do
Yeah.
that stuff. Like, because
Shout to
I guarantee
2008.
people will be putting emulators on this and playing Nintendo games on their Steam decks, in the same way that you can like do that on a any any kind of PC, really. Like the fact that it is a portable PC, you can get all of those worlds together if you really want them. And there will be people that like like the thing I'm almost most interested in that regard is how active are Nintendo's lawyers going to be at trying to keep
Mm.
stuff off of the Steam Deck,
Mm.
because they're probably the ones that obviously would be most impacted, because this will be the most of a direct competitor to the Switch.
Yeah.
Obviously the comparisons there are not subtle. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I see in, like, I don't really know how Linux really plays into all that anyway, because I don't like, I Linux and PC is synonymous to me, and I know it's not really, but
Mm-hmm.
for as plebeian as I am of a PC gamer, like I wouldn't have even thought about the Linux element apart from the fact that they've come out and said like yes, Linux is like the ideal, but this will run anything.
Point number 3. Handheld gaming PCs are neat, and deck might be the best yet. It's your turn, Trevor. What was your thoughts on that?
I mean, my thought on that. So this is another one. Really, I haven't dealt with any. I haven't like played with any of the Nvidia stuff or anything like that. Apart from like, I think maybe I've played at a PAX or something like that here or there. Um, but it is. I mean, it's largely my thought is like the first question any game gets these days is, okay, cool. When's it coming to Switch? And so if they don't even have to like answer that now and be like, well, I mean, we'll maybe come there eventually, but if you have a Steam Deck, you can play it in handheld, as desired, or you can play it on PC. Like the, I think that's their, I think that's a huge market potential for this product. And so the idea of having, a PC that can run all these things in handheld mode, in effectively in Switch handheld mode, like that's pretty much exclusively how I've played my Switch. I've played a couple things here and there on my screen, but I play my Switch when I'm going to bed or something like that. So the idea of picking up a Steam Deck and hopping into an indie game 6 months before it makes its way into a different console or onto the Switch, and just being able to play that before bed is incredibly enticing to me. But even beyond that, doing that on like some of the bigger budget games, I would be way more likely to do that than I am, because I sit in front of my computer all day for work, and then when we're podcasting and stuff like that, those are just reasons for me to not really want to get into PC gaming myself. So like having a PC that is dissociated from that relationship that I have with PCs, that is a handheld version of a PC. Like I could play other games on that PC. I could go into the Steam library. Like I tweeted at John Phipps, Game Dad JP, my compatriot in wanting the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters on a Switch. You can buy those pixel remasters on Steam and play them on this, and you'll have them in handheld, and that'll be an ideal, a certainly a more ideal way than playing on mobile, and for me more ideal than playing on my PC. So I can play those games in like it's giving me what I want for those games, even if they're not going to give it to me on Switch.
I think this is the one for me that I sort of disagree with among the most, if only because Steam Deck isn't the Switch, right? I just think, sort of like PlayStation has shown, Nintendo has a weird magic for handheld devices. I don't really know what it is.
I have that point made in one of my later arguments.
Yeah,
like
and so
specific, like Nintendo gets a magical pass on X, Y, and Z.
on everything, right? And so, I mean, you were like the biggest. We talk about this all of the time. We could do a whole podcast about just Nintendo getting away with shit. But like, I'm just really leery, I think, of the argument that like Steam Deck is better really having any sort of resonance. Like it's gonna matter to like the select few people that's gonna matter to, but like I just think that for most people this isn't the Nintendo Switch, and so they're not gonna care as much, right? Like if you're gonna get a handheld device, if you don't have one right now, you're gonna get the Switch is what you're probably gonna do. You're not gonna get this. And like I think it's sort of gonna be a longer term problem, right? Like for me, I have a Switch, but let's say I didn't and I wanted a handheld gaming device, right? Like I would go towards that before I would go to one thing. And part of that is because fuck PC gaming. Not really, it's fine. But like it's just not my forte. It's obviously not either one of our kind of fortes is PC gaming really here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would naturally grab towards one towards the other. But also because like, right, for me, part of what does make Nintendo special, I will acknowledge, is the core few franchises it has that you can only play on Nintendo, right? Whereas for PC gaming, it's not really core franchise that are PC gaming only. certainly that appeal to me other than like Civilization. And I don't need to play that on handheld mode. That sounds lit actually, but like I wouldn't like it's not gonna buy me a console, right? And so I don't know the long term nature of that. I just think that handheld gaming is really hard, right? Like I think there's such a niche crowd for handheld gaming that is like not the same as console gaming. Like I think that's one of the things that PlayStation learned is that they're actually two pretty different audiences in some ways between like PC, not between PC, between console and handheld gaming. Like they want different things out of those devices, and so I'll be curious to see how they go about marketing this more and more as it kind of goes on, and we're not just like in the first 10 days of it existing, and how they kind of push it and what they kind of bring forward to it. And this kind of leads me to point number 4, which is, and also what kind of games they have. Like, what if they have anything that's just like a special, like really stand out, like, oh, I need this on Steam and I want to play it on handheld mode. It's like actual push to put it on Steam Deck, right? And play it on Steam Deck, right? And obviously, point number 4 in the Verge article is Valve's a game company again. And I think this is one of the single biggest strengths that this is going for, is that Valve is a games company again, right? They actually not just make games, but make, like the article kind of alludes to, one of the Game of the Year kind of contenders for last year, and Half-Life Alyx. And so I'm really excited to see what they do on the game side of things and what they kind of bring forward, because Valve is clearly a talented team. They have a lot of great, I think, people working there that can make great games. We've seen that, and make great games, I should note, for kind of non-traditional platforms, obviously with VR, right? And so like I would love to see what a great Valve handheld game looks like, right? Like what does that look like, and what is a great kind of fully fleshed out from the ground up, worked on for years, Valve game look like, right? Like what do they do in the wake of Half-Life Alyx? Where do they go from there? I think is one of the most exciting things, because ultimately, like you talked about in the very first point, where companies make their money is not with hardware sales, it's with software sales. And so ultimately, the Steam Deck can be the greatest invention ever made, but if there's nothing to play on it, then people won't play it, right? And so that's sort of, this is also kind of ties into the next point a little bit too, but like, you know, if you only get in one purchase out of them, and that's to buy the console and then nothing else afterwards, it's still ultimately a loss and a failure. And so we'll see about that, and I'll get more into that in point number 5. But for point number 4, I think this is one of the great strengths, is that Valve is doing games shit again, really.
Yeah, I mean, like the fact that Valve can be putting games on there, and the article, of course, yeah, as you said, kind of goes into Half-Life Alyx as the example, but then even that is evoking the fact that when Steam originally launched, like Half-Life 2 was the must-have app on Steam, and Steam obviously has blown up beyond everything, because like PC gaming was largely kind of dead there for a while. Like it was, consoles had kind of taken over and PC became the niche thing, and now PC gaming has just kind of ballooned more and more than anything over the years, probably. And I think the thing that ties into this, like you're saying, like do they have to have their own exclusive game? No, but like theoretically any of the 182 games I'm looking at here in my Steam library will play on a Steam
Trevor
Deck.
with the facts. Yeah.
And I can then take, I mean, like I remember one of the first things that people were like excited about, like why would I get a Steam Deck instead of a Switch, was the idea of like, well, you can play a fully modded out version of Skyrim on the Steam Deck that you couldn't, like you can't do on the Switch. Like there are going to be limitations there and stuff like that. And so like there are elements like that like I could play those. I could play the Emily is Away games right now on my PC, or I could play them on Steam Deck as I'm winding down before bed. So I think there is a potential, because I mean, even going back to the kind of the handheld market conversation, like, yeah, the Vita didn't work for Sony, but the PSP really worked for Sony.
Yeah.
So like even they had like success. Nintendo has had like arguably like their best successes in the handheld space.
Yeah.
With the Game Boy, obviously, into the DS, into the 3DS generation, and then now obviously the Switch. So there's an audience there for it, and a lot of times that maybe is the audience that is a casual audience that right now would be playing on a phone, but hey, maybe they're open to playing a bigger experience still in that handheld space. Or maybe it is just going to be people that have a nice gaming PC that are going to also play this for when they're on the road, like with the Switch, or for when they're, winding down before bed and can't be playing on their mouse and keyboard, as they're drifting off to sleep. So I think in addition to any potential games, like the thing had a very tongue-in-cheek tweet about Half-Life 3 being teased as like a Valve or a Steam Deck kind of like exclusive. And I don't think Valve would make anything Steam Deck exclusive, but they might be able to optimize things for the Steam Deck and the specific like controllers and everything that the Steam Deck has, which certainly would be interesting. I, as somebody who like never really got into the hype behind Half-Life, like I've played the games and I enjoy them fine. I would love to sit down and play Half-Life Alyx. But like really what potentially excites me would be if they came back and made like a Portal as like, we've made a Portal 3 that is optimized for the Steam Deck, and maybe that's going to be their big selling point. That'd be great. I don't know if they'll ever make any deliberate games for the Steam Deck, but there's already a massive library of games available to you in the Steam library across their own first party stuff, but then much more so across the indie space and
Beyond
across
that,
like
yeah.
the fact that like a lot of Xbox games are on Steam. A lot of PlayStation games are increasingly going onto Steam. Like if you, and this goes into as you kind of touched on a little bit more the next point, but like, hey, if you can't get your hands on a Series X right now or a PS5, but you still want those games that are out there available on Steam, this might be a thing for you that you can do. Because like we haven't delved into it, but another element of this is this thing can also be docked, and you could play it in a docked mode on your TV or something like that, and have a similar experience as you would with a Switch. So like if you want to play Death Stranding and don't have a PlayStation and you want to dive into the director's cut or whatever, like go nuts on Steam, like buy it on Steam, play it, have fun with whatever mods are out there, and go crazy on the Steam Deck. Like that's not for me, but like there is an audience for it out there. I think we saw with stuff like Among Us last year, or I know Cam got really into Valheim, and like the games that, I mean, like even going back to like PUBG, basically kicking off the whole battle royale thing, like PC still has a huge place in the space, even if it's not a space that you and I particularly spend a ton of time in. Like there are crazy audiences out there in the PC space. So if this is a way of like tapping into that audience with another option that they can take those games and then play them on the go too, I think there's a huge market for those people.
Agreed. Point number 5. Gaming dollars are burning a hole in people's pockets. This is actually the point that I disagree with more than anything else on the list. And I literally just wrote, true, but we won't buy anything. And then it was like, well, we won't play anything, technically. Well, people might buy this. All the people might buy this Steam Deck. But that doesn't mean they're going to play it. I think of, as Trevor likes to talk about all the time, his various Xbox consoles that he essentially plays like twice a year, right? Or even for both of us, the Nintendo Switch, which is we own, but how often? I mean, I play my Switch essentially like 3 or 4 times a year, right? I don't play it that much.
Yep.
The PlayStation 4 or 5 is kind of the primary console.
I mean, I picked up a Stadia controller and an Amazon Luna controller and have tried both of those.
You're the person I'm talking about.
Exactly.
You'll buy it, but it doesn't mean you're going to play it, right? And so I think The Milwaukee Bucks won the NBA title. So I think I actually got the alert. So I think that I'm really leery of the idea that just because people have also who are these people that have disposable income, but the people that have disposable income after, a year of the pandemic and everything are going to use it on this, right? Like it goes into how people who've been waiting for a PS5 or a Series X, or who are going to wait for like, the shiny new Switch, are going to get this instead. And it's like, I think those are very different consumers, right? Like, I think if you want a PS5 and you haven't been able to get one for a year and you see this come out, I don't think you're really going to be like, I want this instead, right? Like, I don't think that's the same thing. And I think it's the same for if you want like a Nintendo Switch, like new version, Switch Pro, whatever we're calling it, and you see this come out, I don't think it's suddenly going to be like, oh, I'm going to get that instead, right? Like, I think to the earlier point I made, these are very different audiences, whether you're talking about like PC, console, or handheld. And I just don't really buy into the notion that because people have had a hard time getting PlayStations and Xboxes, or might have a hard time getting Switches, they're going to suddenly just use that money instead on getting a Steam Deck, right? Or that they're going to have first off, what extra money are we having during the pandemic? But second off, that they're going to use their excess money to get this instead of getting more games on the consoles that they already have, right? Or more like upgrades of devices on those kind of things, right? Like, I really don't agree with that notion. And so I'll be really like it, because it talks about how there's never been a better time to play video games and that demand has never been higher, but that demand is for certain things, right? Certain consoles, certain games, that kind of stuff. So I'll be really curious to see what sort of, data it's pulling from to kind of support this. This seems to me like the least, like the claim backed up at least amount of like, here's why we think this. More of just like, people have extra money in a pandemic because they couldn't go anywhere, and it's like, well, that money was used on other things. So, so I'll be very curious about this one. This is definitely the one that I'm the least confident about. And again, goes back into that point I made in the first kind of point we talked about, where like, I think you have to set reasonable expectations if you're Valve of what this device is going to sell, right? Like, I think you can't go in it with point number 5 in the back head, being like, people have a lot of money, they can't get these other consoles, they're going to get ours instead, and they're going to buy 25 million units worth of the Steam Deck, right? Like, I think that is a completely like wrong-headed idea to have kind of going into this, right? Like, I think you have to set much simpler expectations, because it's better to set a goal and to achieve it than to set a crazy high goal and then fail to meet it, right? And so that's sort of what I hope Valve does. And I'll just be really curious about that, because this is the point I'm the least confident in.
Yeah, I think this one is very much the like most first world type of argument. And it is like somebody who clearly has, disposable income and can make this case. The one thing I would say that I think makes this a potentially more like a better value option.
Sell it on me.
If you were going to be, if you can't get a PS5 or a Series X or whatever, or even a, an OLED Switch model or whatever, is the software itself. I think, and this is something I think Steam would have to really sell, games are almost always on sale on Steam. Versus, I feel like you could build up your library of games for cheaper than that same library on Switch, because of the things that Nintendo puts in place for their deals, or the things that the PlayStation Store puts in place. I feel like one of the few things I know about like Steam is how pretty much everybody gets in on the Steam sales every year, and they happen multiple times a year. And so like, you can be a more savvy consumer on Steam, buy all those games for cheaper, and then play them on your Steam Deck, versus buying those same games probably at higher prices on Switch, or a handful of those same games on Xbox or PlayStation. So I think that's the bigger selling point, especially if you're not in any of these things for the first party exclusives. because again, I think as we kind of touched on, probably not going to have too many first party exclusives drawing people to the Steam Deck, and it is going to be largely building on the third party support. Even like Ubisoft in their earnings call as today, as of recording, they mentioned the idea of like, maybe if it's big enough, we'll put our games on it. And it's like, well, that's like, if your games are already on Steam, they'll be on the Steam Deck. But I'm sure they're talking about like, oh, if it's big enough, we'll put a Ubisoft, UB Plus or whatever their Uplay app on the thing that allows you to play Immortals Phoenix Rising or whatever the latest Assassin's Creed games are. Like, I'm sure they would get into that in the same vein. So I think that's the biggest potential in the conversation of, if you've got gaming dollars burning a hole in your pocket, those gaming dollars could probably be stretched further on a Steam-based device, be it your Steam PC or a Steam Deck, because of just how often those games are discounted on sale. And that leads into a whole other like aspect of like, has Steam devalued games so much that people just wait until they go on sale to buy those games? Yeah, a little bit. But because it's been built into kind of that business model, it's also expected. So I think that's the biggest argument I would make there. But yeah, it's like I did have the kind of facetious like, can't get your hands on a PS5 or Xbox Series X? We'll spend that money on this handheld PC instead. It's like, yeah, you're probably not going to have a ton of people doing that.
Yeah.
But I think especially in lieu of the somewhat lackluster Switch thing that we kind of touched on in was it last week's episode? I don't remember.
Time's a black hole.
Yeah, the fact that like they're not doing a Switch Pro, which also came out as like other news this week of like Nintendo actually coming out and basically refuting and saying we have no plans on releasing any further consoles at this time. Like, this is the closest thing to the Switch Pro that people are going to get. It just won't have the Nintendo games that maybe people are only going to buy the Switch Pro for.
I agree. I think it is a silly point as well. The sixth and final point, essentially is like the wrap up, I think, and sort of a weird point of why it'll be successful, because it's basically them saying it might not be, but it'll be okay, which is simply Valve can afford a hobby or two. And for this one, I'm really just going to kind of read just chunks of this because I find it really interesting, of just like, even if the Steam Deck doesn't attract gamers away from next-gen consoles or graphic cards, that doesn't mean it'll flop. So far, every piece of hardware Valve has built is a gadget its own engineers wanted to see in the world, not a piece of mass-market kit who needs mass-market kits. But if the Steam Deck winds up being a niche product that barely sells, it might still be a success for the company and fans. So I would simply say that is a pretty generous redefinition of what a success is. Right? Like, I think most people in the video industry most hardware manufacturers don't make their hardware to be a niche product by some fans.
Yeah, you do have the play date that is out there with the crank and whatnot.
Yeah, they generally prefer it to be a mass market thing, right? So it might eventually be that, and they can develop some sort of community around that, like the Vita. But I don't know if anyone would call that a success. Just like I don't think most people call the Vita ultimately a success, even though it has a really great library of games and had
an incredible
really
attach rate.
Yeah, an incredible attach rate and a really great community around it. I don't know if you'd still be able to call that a success. And I think similarly, Steam Deck can have this really great community around it, and have great games on it, mainly because Steam has great games. They're just pulling from that, like you kind of alluded to. But I don't know if you'd be able to call it a success if it is just kind of that niche market it's going to and isn't ever able to expand it beyond that. And that ultimately carries me over to kind of my final, what do I predict hat on the thing, which is I predict it to be exactly that. I predict it to be a niche product by this select group of kind of fans, and for it not really to break into like a mass market, vein of things like the Switch would. In fact, the more we've talked about it tonight, the more I've been convinced of that. Even just like, I think it is exactly going to be a PC Vita. I think it's going to be kind of that story. There are going to be people who love this and talk about it, and like a decade after it came out, are going to be like, "Yo, the Steam Deck is great, guys." And then most of us are going to probably not own one. Maybe own one and play it occasionally, right? Like, I think it's gonna have that dedicated community around it. I don't think it's gonna get huge. I don't think it's gonna like blow up. I think it'll be a niche product that Valve's designers and engineers really want to see, and that some fans really like, right? Like, that's sort of the expectation I have for this, right? Like, I think Valve is gonna give it enough support to be that, and so that's sort of what I'm seeing through the crystal ball of my predictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that wouldn't surprise me. I think, especially based on kind of the at least the fervor in like my Twitter feed around when the thing went live and everything. Like everybody was trying to get one, but that's also like the target audience of who's going for this. Like there is an element of, hey, the people that spend $3,000 on a PC on a like a high end gaming PC, are they going to be willing to throw another $400 to play those same games, but in the comfort of their bed or something like that? Maybe. Like they clearly care enough about gaming to put that money into it. But then, like, on the flip side, are the people that don't spend a butt ton of money on those rigs, but hey, for this extra little peripheral, extra few $100, you can get a peripheral that does allow you to play all of those games that you already have in your library again, and like on the go or on your in your bed or whatever, or just as a second screen experience or something like that. Yeah, maybe they'll pick that up. I think to the conversation around like what is Steam expecting on this, as the article alludes to, and the fact that Steam did say like, hey, like if you're going in and logging in and buying this now, you're putting down a deposit, and we're gonna like it's gonna be first come first served. So you're going to get it when like when we have the supplies. And I think like as of today, as we were talking about this, I think they're already basically like backed up to Q3 of next year, of 2022. Mm-hmm. Like I'll admit, like I picked up one. I bought into the fervor and stuff and was like, it'll be an interesting thing. There are enough PC games that I would love to sit down and play if I didn't have the resistance that I have of sitting down and playing here in front of my PC. So like mine is slated for Q1 of next year. So I'm in on the earlier side of things. I don't know, because the whole thing's coming out in December anyway. So I don't know how many they'll have like at launch in the first batches to go. But the fact that they are basically like manufacturing to order is, I think, the smart call. And it's just like, as opposed to the Stadia controllers that they were just giving those things away with a whole bunch of different things by a year in. It's like, hey, do you have a YouTube like a YouTube Premium account? Here, like we'll give you a free Chromecast and Stadia controller. So I ended up getting a second one of those for free, just because I was already paying for this other thing in the Google Suite. So I think ultimately, like, it is going to come down to they're not looking to make the money off this. They're looking to give this to people to make money off more software. And if this is another way that they'll get people to be buying more things, then they'll end up making their money off that. So if ultimately it flops and they sell through like this, the first few batches or however many it is that are going to carry them through to Q3 of next year or whatever, I think, like, I don't know how many that will ultimately end up being, but then if like nothing sells after that, well, hey, they're also not manufacturing more really than that either. Yeah. So they'll continue to kind of like create supply as the demand calls for it, which is it's a way better business model as compared to the continued frustrations that people are having with like everything selling out and not being able to get a hold of the new consoles, especially because like obviously the semiconductor shortages and everything are all playing into all of these elements where their demand was going to be limited anyway, just because of COVID related supply problems. So I think at least in that regard, they're making a bet on it, but it is a reserved bet, as kind of the argument makes. And
Yeah.
ultimately, if the whole thing fails, they make $6 billion annually off of just
Mhm.
the Steam commissions
Yeah.
anyway, as the article kind of touched on. So it's like they could lose everything on this, and
Yeah.
they're not out too much. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it all goes from here. Ultimately, like I see this mostly as like a, a Switch competitor more so than a PlayStation or Xbox competitor.
Agreed. Agreed.
But even that, I don't even see it necessarily as a Switch competitor so much as like,
Agreed
hey,
again.
here is a way to take your PC library and do the Switch thing that everybody has gotten, crazy about, because there are like 70 billion Switches in the wild or something like that. So like,
Who knows?
there's clearly an audience to play games on the go in handheld mode or whatever that is. And if there's crossover potential between the PC audience and that audience in the Switch space, that, like, I'm sure they're game for it. Because yeah, it'll all come down to like, will it my thing was, it's priced like a next gen console, but it doesn't have the performance, as kind of is touched on in their, like, why it might still get dunked on section of the article
Yeah.
here. And going back to what we talked about earlier, I my note there was, yeah, it doesn't have the performance of a new gen console, and they also don't have the magical Nintendo factor that gives them a pass for that,
Yeah.
for it not being like a high end PC option or whatever. So it'd be interesting. But then you still have in the conversation of all this, like, if it can also then double as an xCloud device or a Stadia device or whatever, like, then you've got all those other, like, the future cloud gaming options that everybody's trying to kind of commit to and get behind
Mm-hmm.
in Switch form. And like, hey, how cool would it, like, if you could play, before bed, if you could play Assassin's Creed Odyssey and be, going around playing some
That's a great point.
some islands with Cassandra on a
Oh
Switch like
yeah.
device, like, that sounds like it'd be something you'd be interested in. Maybe not $400 interested in, but you find a few of those options for you, and you might be out there. I mean, you could play Warzone on this thing as you do a match of Warzone as you wind down for bed or whatever. I think there's, like, it'll be interesting to see ultimately how it goes. I'm interested enough to buy into it myself. And I think there are, like, another thing that somebody, like, posted that I hadn't even thought about was like, will I be able to play this, like, The Sims on this? And I'm like, that could be a fun one. Like, it could be fun to get back into The Sims, because I'm not going to sit down and do that I'm not going to do it on my console necessarily, and I'm not going to spend a long session like that on, my PC, but that might be a fun thing to hop into before bed, or lay in bed and just not get out of bed on a
SimCity.
lazy Sunday or something like that.
Civilization, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, especially Civilization would be a ton of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see.
I mean, hell, one of the things I certainly also wanted to bring up, like, as somebody who's recently gotten super into Final Fantasy 14, like,
yeah.
while I'm quite content to play it on the console, obviously, because I'm playing it on my PlayStation, like, I'm constantly kind of sitting there and being like, it would be a way easier and better experience if I was playing this on PC. I could have all the whole bunch of more, like, things that I can easily kind of hit with keyboard functions. But then also, it'd be fun to play Final Fantasy 14 in bed and go and do, like, because as I joked with Cam or talked with Cam, like, I've gotten super into, like, the non-combat focused nerdy stuff of, like, hey, I'll just go to an area and mine some ore and just kind of zone out and zen out on that kind of thing. And I can easily do that in bed. That's not a high stakes, like, I need to be in the moment kind of experience. But, like, that would like, it's entirely possible that the Steam Deck will end up being like a Final Fantasy device, like the original PlayStation was for me, where I get that the pixel remasters. I'm playing those. I'm playing Final Fantasy 14. I'm playing all of the other Final Fantasy games that are already in my Steam library. I could just play all of them on the Steam Deck. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. I'm sure this will not be the last time we talk about the Steam Deck on That News You Care About, but that's all we're talking about right now. That's the end of the episode. You made it. Hey, congrats. If you like what you heard, you can go support us over at patreon.com/thatnerdysite. Like all of our wonderful patrons have. Their support, your support means the world to us and helps make shows like this and like that D Plus show happen. So thank you so much for that. Again, that is patreon.com/thatnerdysite. You can go support us over at. Go check out all the tiers, gadgets, goals, and monthly Patreon exclusive episodes and all the other goodies you get out there. There are a ton of good stuff. You can also go support us by liking, subscribing, and sharing with your friends on podcast services all around the globe. Rate and reviewing us on iTunes, giving us 5 stars. Tell us why you like us. Leave us a nice little review. It'll make me and Trevor happy when we go read them once every 5 weeks. You can also go
way more rare than that.
You can also go over to youtube.com/thatnerdysite. Hit the big subscribe button as we continue our climb up there. And go check out all of our Let's Play series, as well as video versions of every week's podcast as well. Otherwise, you can go over to thatnerdysite.com, check out all the written content there. Otherwise, you can go find Trevor at Trevor J. Starkey on the internet. Trevor, anything that you want to shout out?
I will shout out our Summer of Star Wars that we're doing. Logan and I talked for like an hour and a half before we even started recording this one.
Almost 2 hours, yeah.
On The Last Jedi. So I guarantee our conversation that we'll actually do recorded on the podcast later this week with adding Cam and Frank into the mix will be invigorating conversation, to be sure. So check out that D Plus show and our Summer of Star Wars as we go through this entire summer watching all the Star Wars movies. We're almost wrapped up with the Skywalker saga. This week is Last Jedi. Then we'll wrap it up next week here at the end of July with Rise of Skywalker. And then August we'll be doing all the miscellaneous one-offs, your Rogue Ones, your Solos, your The Clone Wars animated, as well as the Empire of Dreams documentary. So, a fun kind of like it's been great for me to like know exactly what I'm doing each week with that one, as opposed to like randomly being like, hey, I got to figure out what random thing I'm going to watch this week on that D Plus show. So yeah, check that out.
Agreed. You can go find me at Lefty Logie or Lefty Logie, Loggy on the internet. I will also second Trevor's Summer of Star Wars shout out, as well as give a shout out to Trevor's latest Let's Play that went live as of today recording. So yesterday when you listen to this, of him doing Hitman 3 Let's Plays that was inspired by Outside Xbox.
Yep.
And there are 3 things. That'd be a fun one to do if we could figure it out to do me and you doing different versions of Hitman as well. Technically that's going to be a mess, but that'd be a fun thing to, I guess it wouldn't be too hard to do as well. So go check that out. Is pretty good. And otherwise you can go check out That Nerd Site at That Nerd Site all across the internet. For myself, for Trevor, for all of the all the happy Milwaukee Buck fans, all the sad Phoenix Sun fans out there, maybe next year, and play games and be good to each other.